Good afternoon, Irinislav in Bulgaria. Good morning, David Blackmon in Texas.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
Energy Transition Episode 25. Our topic today is solar and wind constancies. This week, there was another discussion about wind and solar variability and energy security. With so much natural gas in the US and even exporting natural gas, was there a crisis in Texas with renewable energy, David?
Well, I don't think it's a crisis so much as it is for us in Texas, it's a lack of the ability to manage everything in our power grid. We have an abundance of generating capacity in Texas. For example, ERCOT, our grid manager, says that we have upwards of 115,000 megawatt hours of generating capacity in our grid. And demand this summer has hovered between 78,000 and 81,000 megawatts each day as we've gone through this massive heat wave. But of course, the problem is that about 35% or so of that capacity is either wind power or solar power. And when you get into these very hot summer days in Texas, and the temperatures reach up over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the wind tends to die down. And most of that renewable capacity is wind power, about 80% of it. So you tend to lose the great preponderance of the wind generating capacity during the heat of the day when demand is at its highest. And so ERCOT and our our politicians in Austin haven't figured out exactly how to properly incent the building of the right amount of each form of generating capacity here in Texas. We have a shortage of natural gas capacity, which is of course reliable and you want to have available for when the wind stops blowing and the sun isn't shining. And we just don't have enough of that in Texas. And that's the real nub of the problem here in our state. And it's a similar issue in California as well.
And Irina, in Europe, wind and solar are being used as primary energies or complementary energies?
Well, they're trying to turn them into primary energy sources, but as we have all seen, it's not exactly working. I was just reminded today of UK's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's statement or ambition that the UK can turn into the Saudi Arabia of wind power. Leaving aside the obvious, absurdity of such a statement, right now the UK is not producing a lot of electricity from wind power. It's producing a lot of electricity from gas. So I think wind and solar, even in Europe, which is at the forefront of the energy revolution, are still both rather complementary sources of energy than primary and dominant sources of energy.
And David, in Texas, wind is constant in the summer time, or is in winter is different?
No, it's quite variable. There are, Texas does have more installed wind capacity than any other state, and by far, I mean, it's not even close. And because we do have the very flat regions of West Texas, where the wind does blow much of the time, not most of the time, much of the time, and it's variable throughout the day, and that's a big part of the problem. Is that our computer models that our grid managers use will tell the officials at ERCOT, well, you can anticipate having X megawatts of wind on the grid at this time of day. And so it's safe to let a certain number of natural gas power plants go offline for maintenance at that time because you're going to have enough wind and or solar to fill in. And if that doesn't happen, then that's where ERCOT ends up getting caught short of actual generation on the grid. And that's happened several times over the last couple of years. And the real critical factor we have this summer right now in Texas is that to keep the lights on and keep people comfortable in their air conditioning here in Texas, which is vital to our comfortable lifestyles here. ERCOT has been forcing some older natural gas plants and coal-fired plants that we have remaining to stay online constantly without doing their periodic maintenance, trying to delay that until we get the fall and the weather calms down. And so the big concern that I have, and I think a lot of people have, is, we could get into a really hot day in August and have a couple or three of those power plants with big capacity factors suddenly go offline because something breaks, because they've been run too consistently. And that's a big risk they're taking. So far it's worked out, and I'm praying it'll work out the rest of summer, because I don't want to have a big blackout in my neighborhood. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping we get lucky.
Irina, I see that you published an article today about lack of some kind of metals, minerals. I don't know exactly which one. Could you please
copper.
Oh,
yeah.
copper.
A copper shortage is coming, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Could you please explain a little bit more?
Yeah, well, actually, people from the mining industry have been warning about it for a while now, that ore grades are falling, which means you need to mine more ore for the same amount of copper, to get the same amount of copper that you used to get, for example, 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. So this makes mining for copper more energy intensive. And there are very few new mines coming online, because mining is a dirty business. We hate mining. It destroys the environment. It does destroy parts of the planet. And we're going to need a lot more copper in the coming years and decades if the energy transition is going to go as planned. It's already not going as planned. But if these ambitions and plans persist, well, yeah, I mean, if you're not planning for contingencies, this is what you get.
Right.
But I see government plans in Europe and the US are unchanged. We're going all renewable. So we're going to be needing a lot more copper than we need now. And that's, of course, on top of the copper we already use for things like, wiring or electronics and all the things that copper is being used for. And there is nothing, nowhere for this copper to come from. I mean, the latest warning came from the new CEO of Anglo American. He was pretty blunt. Of course, you could say that he has a vested interest in creating panic on the market, so, the price of copper goes up. But I think the man was quite sincere in saying that there's no copper. There will be no copper, and he expected people to wake up hoping it will be sooner rather than later. Because really, it's not just EVs. EVs use a lot more copper than internal combustion engine cars.
A lot more, yeah.
A lot more, yeah, 4 times more, something like this. And, the energy transition sees the electrification of transport by producing a lot more electric vehicles, and that's just electric vehicles. Solar farms need a lot of copper, well, not as much copper, per unit of energy, but they do need a lot of copper. And if we're going to be making huge utility scale solar farms, that's a lot of copper. Wind farms, even more. This copper has to come from somewhere. And you have to factor in resource nationalism, of which I'm kind of a fan, because it's making everything a lot more interesting, as if it's not interesting enough. But you've got governments in South America and in Africa insisting on getting more for their resources, which is natural, I think.
Yeah.
It could be seen as greed, and I would agree with that too. But the fact of the matter is they want more for their resources. And that's, that might not be in line with the planned expenditure that mining companies are willing to make. So yeah, we're in for more uncertain times. Remember a while ago, somebody called copper the new oil, and I believe this might well become the case in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
David, do you believe that the world will be electrified soon, or will take a long time for that?
I don't think that will ever happen, and for exactly the reasons Irina was just talking about, the resource limitations. Nobody seems to want to recognize and try to innovate around these resource limitations. It's not just copper, it's lithium, which, I think Irina and I both have written about quite extensively over the last couple of years. It's antimony, it's cobalt, it's graphite, it's tungsten. It's this wide array of critical minerals, and they're all resource limited, and they all have to be mined. Yes, you can get lithium out of salt water, and that's done widely around the world. But the fact is, a lot of lithium supply comes from hard rock mining, just like copper, and just like all these other minerals do. And you have to be able to mine for them to extract them from the earth. And the same people who are pushing this energy transition and who are big advocates of wind power and solar power and electric vehicles are out there protesting every time somebody wants to open a new mine for one of these minerals. And you have this huge tension just within the environmentalist community itself about what's really going to be able to happen or not happen in this energy transition. And when you have, we've had lithium prices at one point had risen by 4,000% year over year earlier this year. And copper prices are way up, and prices for other minerals keep going up. Well, what happens? The prices for the electric vehicles have to skyrocket. It's absolutely necessary. And so you have this now in the United States, this $20,000 gap between the average price for an electric vehicle and the average price for an internal combustion engine vehicle. And the federal tax credit in this new Joe Manchin bill of $7,500 isn't going to close that gap. And so they're not competitive. And it just slows everything down and prevents the transition from happening. And it's not going to happen the way the advocates say it is, because of these resource and other physical limitations that are just part of the real world. And we talk about it all the time. We have to deal with what's possible in the real world, and electrification, total electrification, unless we want to go back to a 19th century existence, which a lot of these environmentalists want us to do, is simply not possible. So, we have to deal with what's real.
They should lead by example,
Sure.
or leading by example. I mean, drop your electronics.
Yeah. Sell your
drop
car,
your
trade it for a horse and
electricity.
buggy, and yeah.
Yeah, or just walk. Okay, they can use bicycles. That's fine, I think.
Right.
But try it and then see how it goes and see if you like it.
Yeah.
And
well,
then
if you go back to horses, then environmentalists are going to be protesting about the manure on the streets.
Horses are bad,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
Horses are good. And the International Energy Agency is not taking consideration this limitation for mining and to issue the orientations. How they do that?
I think they acknowledge it. I mean, they have been saying that we will need to step up mining of critical metals, but that's about as far as they go, because they don't talk about the emissions related to mining, because the mining industry is far from solarized and winterized. I mean, most mining in the world is not done by battery-powered trucks, because there are not enough battery-powered trucks that can reliably be used to mine all these critical metals. Again, I think mostly we're talking about fantasy world versus real world. Things you really, really want to be doing and things that you can realistically be doing, which is mining with diesel or gasoline powered equipment, diesel, I believe, and not battery powered trucks, especially since, as I said, mining is going to be increasingly energy intensive because there are not as much mineral resource in the Earth's crust as there was 100 years ago, because we use that.
Well, that's right. And I
They're
don't want to,
finite. Metals and
Right.
minerals, just like oil and gas, they're finite.
exactly. And so just a great example that I wrote about recently. We have a company here in the US that's trying to open our first hard rock lithium mine, right? If they get this mine open, they've been working on it for 6 years. It'll be the first one in the United States in decades. And it's being held up by the federal government in order to protect a subspecies of buckwheat that exists on 10 acres adjacent to where this mine would be sited, okay? Buckwheat. And that has been now at least a 2-year holdup in the opening of this mine. And it's, the effort to stop this mine is being led by the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a left-wing environmentalist organization that, regularly touts the potential for renewable energy and electric vehicles. But you can't have any of that without lithium. And unless we want the world to remain completely dependent on China for lithium supplies, which is where all the hard rock lithium goes to be processed today, we're going to have to mine for it in the United States. But you can't, because there's 10 acres of buckwheat over here.
Is that the only place that this species of buckwheat
It's
grows?
the only place it's been found in the United States. And it's what differentiates it from the buckwheat that's everywhere else is a great mystery to anyone who's not intimately involved in all of it. But ultimately, this is the kind of choice we're ultimately going to have to make. We're going to have to either have the buckwheat or we're going to have the transition. It's the realities of the world are going to dictate choices like this having to be made. And, they're fighting against themselves on this.
Yeah, because it sounds like from what you're saying that some people are trying to have a transition without any sacrifices. Well, of course, sacrifices will need to be made, either by destroying the only special subspecies of buckwheat that grows in the vicinity of a lithium mine, or by people severely reducing their energy consumption because there will be not enough energy. Or every new mine is a sort of sacrifice because you're plundering earth, as activists will be quick to point out. You either plunder or you have no transition. I'm sorry.
Yeah, as you said, it in a fantasy or a reality.
Yeah,
exactly.
The two worlds are on a collision course right now. Well, I think they're already in a collision. Yeah. It will be a long one.
So, Irina and David, the conclusion could be the sun is shining and the wind is blowing.
And while they are, all is good.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah. And when they're not, we got problems.
When they're not, yeah.
That's right.
Sadly.
Thank you so much for this nice conversation this Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a great week.
Great week.
You too.
You too. Bye-bye.